Yeah. Okay. Yeah, user interface naming conventions. Yeah, I know the title sounds a bit lame, but yeah, I promise this is mildly interesting. Um, okay, let's break this down. So user interfaces, that's pretty much what you're looking at right now. So it's what you see on your screen, everything you can click on, everything you can interact with. So yeah, you are the user and this is your interface to the computer. And I guess you can imagine that the stuff you see there also has names. And even if you have nothing to do with user interface design, yeah, you probably know many of those names already. So, you probably know that this thing is called a button and checkbox and drop down. But yeah, maybe you don't know that these little three stripes you often see on mobile pages, like in this Wikipedia example here, this is often called a hamburger button or a hamburger menu, because those three stripes, they kind of resemble yeah, a very minimalistic version of a hamburger. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, I think that's just a really cute way to name this thing. And yeah, this is really all I want to talk about. I want to show you some more of these yeah, of these cute and playful naming conventions. So here's a classic one, the desktop. So yeah, this notion of a desktop that pretty much exists across all the yeah, operating systems. And the desktop is basically this easily accessible space where you put all the files and the folders you're currently working on or you often use. Yeah, why is it called desktop though? So yeah, in the pre-digital era, before everybody had a computer, yeah, this is maybe how if you had an office job, then this is maybe how your average workplace looked like. Or I mean, I imagine it that way. It's not like I'm old enough to know from experience, but yeah, you basically had a desk, and on top of that desk, you had a bunch of files and folders you're currently working on. So yeah, that's pretty much already it. But maybe as a side note, if you copy a file, so on your computer, this imaginary location where your file is stored, as long as it's in the state of being copied, it's called the clipboard. And yeah, maybe you can imagine you pick one file up, you put it on the clipboard, you carry it around, you paste it somewhere else. So it feeds nicely into this into this metaphor. And I would say today we are all very used to interacting with the digital user interfaces. But I mean, if you show this, yeah, I mean, you're staring at pretty much a random soup of colors 8 hours a day. And if you show that to someone who lived 100 years ago, then yeah, they certainly have a hard time making sense of that. So maybe you can imagine how these metaphors, yeah, really help to build a bridge between this digital space and yeah, something that used to be familiar to people. And yeah, but it's interesting to see that yeah, these analogies stick around, but today yeah, yeah, the original source is pretty much fading into obscurity. Yeah, so there's an entire Wikipedia article devoted to this desktop metaphor. So if you want, you can scroll through that. And by the way, scrolling, where does this come from? So it's a bit of an unusual word, right? Scrolling, you don't really hear that in any other context. Yeah, what is a scroll? This thing, that's a scroll. And yeah, if you think about it, if you read a Wikipedia article or any website for that matter, it's not like reading a book, right? It's not like you're flipping through discrete pages. It's more like, you're going up and down this continuous band of content. And that's more like reading a scroll, right? So yeah, that's why it's called scrolling. Okay, here's one you maybe don't know. So this is something you often see on some marketing websites, landing page, or they showcase their projects, or some online shop and they showcase their products. You might be tempted to call this a slideshow maybe, but this has some distinct characteristics. So it's first of all, it's moving on itself. It doesn't require you to click or interact with it for it to move. And it loops back on itself. So when you see the last slide, it goes back to the first slide. And this is commonly called a carousel. So I think it's also a really nice analogy, because you can imagine, a carousel, of course, also loops back on itself, and it moves alone on its own. And yeah, it's also kind of a fabulous showcase. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, next one. So what is this? So this is, you have, yeah, pretty much, so some of these sections, and if you click on them, you can expand or collapse them pretty much arbitrarily. It's somewhat of a strategy to, to show a lot of content, but in a space efficient way. And this is commonly called an accordion, because an accordion, it also has these little sections, and it can expand and contract at many, but I think the analogy is even more on point than that, because I mean, there are many things that can expand and contract, right? Why not call it, for example, a spring? So a spring also has these little sections, and it can expand and contract, right? But a spring, if you expand it, it expands everywhere equally. It's not like this UI component, which you press something and at some spots it expands and at some spots it doesn't. That's but for the accordion, it is true. So it can, at some spaces it can expand, at some it can be contracted. And what's also true about the spring is, if you expand it, it doesn't stay in place. It wants to snap back automatically. And yeah, this is not true for this UI component, because you click on something and then it stays as it is. You have to click again for it to collapse again. And it's also more true for the accordion, which kind of maintains its shape after you do something with it. So someone who knows better, who is an accordion expert, can correct me, but yeah. Until then, I think accordion is a good name, spring is a bad name. Okay, so, and here, yeah, this is really my all-time favorite. So this highlighted component here, that's something you see, for example, in Confluence, or yeah, pretty much any page or website that has some hierarchical structure. So where you have pages and subpages and sub-subpages, and yeah, this chain of links, as you traverse, this hierarchy of pages and go deeper and deeper, this chain of links pretty much shows you the way back you came from. So it's, yeah, and this is commonly called breadcrumbs, and that's also kind of an unusual name. So what does that mean? So breadcrumbs pretty much means yeah, little pieces of bread. Yeah, in German you would say Brotkrumen, and yeah, this is a reference to a German fairy tale called Hänsel und Gretel. I'm not sure how well known this is outside of Germany. I think it's actually pretty well known. I don't think Germans came up with this UI component. Yeah, anyway, so in this fairy tale, there are two little siblings and they don't want to get lost in the woods. So they have little pieces of bread, and yeah, as they go deeper and deeper into the woods, they throw the pieces of bread on the ground and they make a trail yeah, out of these pieces of bread. So when they want to go back, they can follow the trail out of the woods again. And maybe you now see how this is analogous to this UI component, because you can imagine every one of these little links represents one breadcrumb, and as you oh no, and it goes yeah, it shows you the way back you came from, the way out of the woods, and yeah, so in the fairy tale it didn't quite work out for the siblings because the bread was eaten by birds or something, but yeah, I think it's still a great analogy, and yeah, that's already all I got. Yeah.